Okay, so we're going to look at the cases that dealt with segregation that we looked at. So obviously we started off looking at Dred Scott. The Dred Scott case, if you remember, is the case where the slave had run away. Dred Scott was a slave. He ran away and wanted to be granted his freedom on account of his, being in a state that was not a slave state. The Supreme Court said no, that essentially because he was an African American, he was a slave, he was not a human, and therefore not entitled to even be in a Supreme Court to begin with. He had no standing for the case. So that's Dred Scott. Slaves, therefore African Americans, are not citizens, and therefore they don't have any rights. That's the Dred Scott case. Then we move on into Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson is a case that dealt with segregated facilities like trains, restaurants, water fountains, schools. Remember, this was the case where the Supreme Court established that it was okay to segregate people because as long as it was equal. So remember, we remembered separate but equal for Plessy versus Ferguson. It's okay to segregate people on account of race so long as the accommodations are equal. For instance, hey, as long as there's a water fountain, what do you have to be complaining about? We know that that's not okay, but that was the explanation. Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned in Brown versus Board of Education. Essentially, the Plessy versus Ferguson had been decided on the basis of the 10th Amendment, not giving the federal government the ability to tell states the rules to make for trains and water fountains and restaurants, etc. The same legal question was presented in Brown versus Board of Education, only the finding was different. In Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment to say that schools could no longer be segregated on account of race, and that the states needed to do away with these state laws that mandated segregation on account of race and integrate the schools. So Dred Scott had to do with essentially saying that black people aren't even people. Plessy, separate but equal. Brown versus Board of Education, desegregate the schools, integrate schools. Racial segregation is wrong because it violates the 14th Amendment.